May 9, 1943. RAF Dyce, Aberdeen, Scotland. British radar operators watched in disbelief as an unidentified aircraft circled their airbase, firing red flares, lowering its landing gear. Two Spitfires scrambled to intercept. What landed that day would change the entire war. Inside that Junkers Ju-88 night fighter was Germany's most closely guarded secret. A radar system so advanced, the British didn't even know it existed. A system that had been slaughtering RAF bomber crews by the hundreds. But within weeks, British engineers would discover something the Luftwaffe never imagined. Their perfect hunting system had a fatal flaw. And that flaw would turn Germany's night fighter force from hunters into prey. It would enable the British to blind thousands of radar sets with strips of aluminum foil. It would allow RAF night fighters to track and destroy German interceptors using their own radar signals. This is the story of the greatest intelligence coup of World War II. A story of desperate bomber crews, brilliant scientists, and one defecting German pilot who handed the Allies the key to winning the air war over Europe. This is the story of how British engineers examined German night fighter radar and realized the Luftwaffe couldn't see the trap. By early 1943, the night skies over Nazi Germany had become a slaughterhouse. Every night, hundreds of RAF bombers droned toward German cities: Lancasters, Halifaxes, Stirlings, Wellingtons, each carrying 7 young men and several tons of high explosives. And every night, dozens failed to return. The statistics were horrifying. In some raids, loss rates exceeded 10%. Do the math. A bomber crew's tour of duty was 30 operations. If you lost 10% per raid, the chances of completing your tour were essentially zero. RAF Bomber Command was losing the air war. The enemy wasn't just flak. It wasn't just searchlights. The real killer prowled invisibly in the darkness. German night fighters, Messerschmitt 110s, Junkers 88s, Dornier 217s, twin-engine Predators stalking the bomber streams, equipped with 20mm cannons that could tear a Lancaster apart in seconds. But here's what terrified the British High Command. These night fighters were finding bombers in total darkness. No moon, thick cloud. Conditions where visual contact should have been impossible. Yet the kills kept mounting. British intelligence knew the Germans had developed some kind of airborne radar. They called it Liechtenstein, but they had no idea how it worked, what frequency it used, how effective it was, and without that information, they couldn't develop countermeasures. The bomber crews were dying, and the British had no idea how to stop it. The German night fighter system was terrifyingly efficient. It was called the Kammhuber line, named after General Josef Kammhuber, who commanded the German night fighter force. Here's how it worked. Germany was divided into defensive boxes, each about 20 miles wide. In each box sat a Freya early warning radar and 2 Würzburg precision tracking radars. When RAF bombers entered a box, the Freya radar detected them at ranges up to 60 miles. The Würzburg radars locked onto individual bombers and tracked them with incredible precision. A ground controller, watching cathode ray tubes in a darkened room, would vector a night fighter into the box. The controller could see both the bomber and the night fighter on his screens. He'd guide the fighter to within a few miles of the target using radio directions. Then the night fighter's pilot would activate his Liechtenstein airborne radar, and the hunt would begin. The Liechtenstein set projected a series of antennas from the nose of the aircraft. These antennas looked ungainly, creating enormous drag, but they worked. The radar operator, sitting behind the pilot, would watch 3 cathode ray tube displays. One showed range, one showed elevation, one showed azimuth. He'd call out corrections. Target bearing 20 degrees, right? Range 2,000 meters. Closing. The pilot would adjust course. Target dead ahead. Range 1,000 meters. Level flight, closer. Target 500 meters, slightly above. The bomber crew had no idea death was approaching. Target 300 meters. Visual contact! And there it was. A dark shape silhouetted against the stars. A Lancaster, wings heavy with bombs, crews scanning the darkness for fighters they'd never see coming. The German pilot would slide into position beneath the bomber's tail, just outside the range of the rear gunner's visibility. Then he'd point his nose up slightly. And fire. Cannon shells ripping upward through the bomber's belly. Through fuel tanks. Through bomb bays. Through crew compartments. Most Lancaster crews died without even knowing what hit them. This was happening every single night, and the British were desperate to stop it. By late 1942, British scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment were certain German night fighters were using airborne radar. They'd detected strange radio signals from moving objects over Germany, but they needed to confirm the exact frequency. Without that, they couldn't design jammers or countermeasures. They needed someone to fly into German airspace and deliberately attract a night fighter attack while recording the radar signals. It was a suicide mission, and they found volunteers. 1474. Flight RAF specialized in signals intelligence. They flew Wellington bombers equipped with special receivers and operators trained to analyze enemy radar. On December 3, 1942, one of these Wellingtons took off from RAF Gransden Lodge as part of a raid on Frankfurt. The pilot was Flight Sergeant Ted Paulton from Windsor, Ontario. His crew were all Canadians except for one man, Pilot Officer Harold Jordan, a British schoolmaster operating the special electronic equipment. Their mission was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Fly into Germany. Fall behind the main bomber stream, simulating a crippled aircraft. Wait for a night fighter to attack. Record the radar frequency while being shot at. Transmit the information home. Try to survive. Harold Jordan, hunched over his receiver mid-fuselage, saw the patterns on his oscilloscope screen change. Someone was painting them with radar. He called forward to the crew. "I'm detecting signals. Probable night fighter." Paulton banked gently away from the main bomber stream, simulating an aircraft in trouble turning back toward England. The signals grew stronger. Jordan prepared a coded message, 492 megahertz. He passed it to the wireless operator, Sergeant Bill Bigaret, who immediately began transmitting. Then the night fighters struck. Cannon shells tore through the fuselage. Jordan was hit in the arm, but he stayed at his post. The rear gunner, Flight Sergeant Everett Vachon, opened fire from his turret. Twin 303 machine guns chattering in the darkness. The Junkers 88. 8 came around for another pass. More cannon fire. Vachon was hit in the shoulder. His turret lost power. Jordan, bleeding from his arm, prepared a second message confirming the frequency. He needed to make sure the information got through. The night fighter attacked head-on. The front gunner, Flight Sergeant Fred Grant, was wounded in the leg. Bigaret left his station to help Grant. A cannon shell exploded near him. Shrapnel tore into both his legs. The Ju-88 attacked again, and again, and again. 10 separate attack runs. 11. The Wellington staggered through the sky, losing altitude. Controls shot away, fabric ripping off the wings. Jordan was hit a second time in the jaw, then a third time in the right eye. Nearly blind, weak from blood loss, Jordan dragged the navigator to his station and tried to teach him how to operate the equipment. He knew he was about to pass out. The information had to get through. The Wellington dropped from 14,000 feet to 500 feet. Paulton fought the controls, corkscrewing violently with every attack. Then suddenly, the night fighter was gone. Out of ammunition or low on fuel, it broke off the attack. The Wellington was a flying wreck. One throttle shot away, the other jammed. Starboard aileron gone. Hydraulics destroyed. Flaps useless. Airspeed indicator blown away. Both turrets smashed. A huge hole in the fuselage. 4 crew members wounded, one of them critically. But Paulton kept flying. He coaxed the dying aircraft back to altitude, 5,000 feet, turned west toward England. At his wireless station, Bigoret, his legs stiff with dried blood, continued transmitting the frequency data. No acknowledgement came back. He kept sending anyway. At 6:45 a.m., the Wellington crossed the French coast at Dunkirk. At 7:20 a.m., they reached England. Paulton planned to ditch in the sea, but in the darkness, he couldn't see the waves clearly enough. He decided to circle until daylight. He asked if anyone wanted to bail out. Bigoret, fearing his wounded legs wouldn't let him crawl out of a ditched aircraft, opted to jump. But after strapping on his parachute and positioning himself at the escape hatch, Bigoret suddenly remembered something. He hadn't locked down his wireless key. Painfully, he dragged himself back to his station and sent one final message. Ditching. Then he clamped the key down so rescuers could fix their position. He jumped. His parachute opened. He drifted to shore near Ramsgate. Paulton brought the burning Wellington down into the sea, 200 yards off the coast. The aircraft remained afloat. The crew scrambled onto the wing. Their dinghy was riddled with holes and sank. Local fishermen rowing nearby had seen them ditch. They pulled alongside and rescued all 5 men. Jordan had lost an eye. All 4 wounded men would survive. And the message had gotten through. Megahertz. Now! British scientists knew the exact frequency of the Liechtenstein radar, but that was only the beginning. 6 months later, May 9, 1943. Oberleutnant Herbert Schmid sat in the cockpit of his Junkers Ju 88R1 night fighter at Kristiansand, Norway. His aircraft was brand new, equipped with the latest Liechtenstein BC radar, state-of-the-art radios, full technical documentation. He was supposed to fly a patrol over the Skagerrak. Instead, he was about to defect to Britain. Herbert Schmid was 29 years old. He'd been flying for the Luftwaffe since before the war, but he'd never shot down a single Allied bomber. This wasn't because he lacked skill. It was because he didn't want to. Schmid hated the Nazis. His wireless operator, Oberfeldwebel Paul Rosenberger, felt the same way. They'd been flying together since 1940, and over the years they'd developed a reputation among their squadron mates as loners who didn't socialize. Their flight engineer, Oberfeldwebel Erich Cantwil, was along for the ride whether he liked it or not. At 4:50 p.m., Schmid's Ju 88 took off from Kristiansand. At 5:10 p.m., Rosenberger sent a false distress message. Starboard engine on fire. Schmid dropped to sea level, below German radar coverage. They dropped 3 life rafts to make it look like they'd crashed. German search and rescue teams triangulated the position and began searching. They found the empty rafts and assumed the crew had perished. Meanwhile, Schmid turned west. Toward Scotland, British radar at Hillhead picked up an unidentified aircraft approaching the coast north of Aberdeen. 2 Spitfires from number 165. Squadron scrambled from RAF Dyce, Flight Lieutenant Arthur Roscoe and Sergeant Ben Scammon. They intercepted the Ju 88 13 miles northwest of Aberdeen. As Roscoe approached, the German aircraft did something extraordinary. It lowered its landing gear, fired red flares, waggled its wings, the universal signal of surrender. Roscoe waggled his wings back. He positioned himself ahead of the Ju 88. Scammon took up position above and behind, and the strange procession flew to Dyce. The airfield's anti-aircraft guns opened fire on the German plane. They scored a few hits, but Schmid kept flying. He entered the circuit, lowered his flaps, and landed. Military police, who appeared almost immediately, surrounded the aircraft. Everyone not involved in a prearranged plan was kept away. Schmid climbed out. He walked over to Roscoe and handed him his life jacket as a thank you for not shooting them down. Roscoe would wear that life jacket for the rest of his tour. Within hours, Schmid's Ju-88 was flying south to RAF Farnborough. Escorted by Beaufighters, the aircraft was given RAF markings and the serial number PJ-876, and then the examination began. British engineers and test pilots had heard rumors of German airborne radar. They'd detected its signals, but they'd never seen the actual equipment. What they found astonished them. The Liechtenstein BC radar was sophisticated, more sophisticated than they'd expected. 3 cathode ray tube displays. One for range, one for azimuth, one for elevation. The system provided remarkably fine resolution. It could track small movements of target aircraft. This significantly increased effective range. The German radios were excellent, better than comparable British equipment in some ways. Schmid had brought complete technical documentation for everything on the aircraft. The British tested the radar extensively. 83 flights, nearly 67 hours of flight time. They tested it against RAF bombers. They measured its capabilities precisely, and as they tested, they realized something extraordinary. This incredible piece of technology had a fatal flaw. Actually, it had several fatal flaws, and now that the British knew about them, they could be exploited. At the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern, scientists pored over the captured Liechtenstein radar. They already knew its frequency from Paulton's suicide mission, 492 megahertz. Now they had the actual equipment. They could see exactly how it worked, and they realized the German night fighter force had just become obsolete. British scientists had actually invented radar jamming chaff back in 1942. The concept was simple. Cut strips of aluminum foil to a specific length corresponding to the radar wavelength you want to jam. Drop thousands of these strips from aircraft. Each strip creates a radar echo. Suddenly, the radar screen is filled with thousands of false targets. The Germans can't tell which echoes are bombers and which are just strips of foil. But there had been a problem. To cut the strips to the right length, you needed to know the exact wavelength of the enemy radar. Too long, and the strips won't resonate properly. Too short, same problem. Ted Paulton's crew had died to get that frequency. 492 megahertz. Now, with the actual Liechtenstein radar in hand, British engineers could test different strip lengths and see exactly what worked best. The optimal dimensions, 30 centimeters long by 1.5 centimeters wide. They called it window.bundles of black paper with aluminum foil on one side. About 2,000 strips per bundle. Each Lancaster bomber would carry several dozen bundles. Every minute, a crew member would push a bundle down the flare chute. The strips would scatter in the bomber's slipstream, creating a cloud of false radar echoes that hung in the air for minutes. Now imagine 700 Lancaster bombers, each dropping window continuously. The radar screens would be completely saturated. Useless. But window had been ready since 1942. Why hadn't the British used it? Because they were terrified the Germans would copy it and use it against British radar defenses. In 1942, Britain was still under threat of German bombing. RAF Fighter Command relied on radar to defend the homeland. If the Luftwaffe got hold of window and used it against British radar, it could enable renewed bombing campaigns against British cities. So window sat in warehouses, unused, while bomber crews died. By mid-1943, two things had changed. First, the Luftwaffe was no longer capable of sustained bombing campaigns against Britain. Most of their night fighter force was committed to defending Germany. Second, bomber command losses had become unsustainable. Something had to be done. In July 1943, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris finally got permission to use window. The target was Hamburg da Operation Gomorrah. The night of July 24, 1943, 7091 British. bombers headed for Hamburg, Lancasters, Halifaxes, Stirlings, Wellingtons. As they crossed the North Sea, the crew members began dropping bundle after bundle, tumbling out of the flare chutes. The strips catching the wind, spreading out, hanging in the air. On the ground in Germany, radar operators stared at their screens in confusion. The neat, orderly plot showing individual bombers had dissolved into chaos. Their screens showed hundreds, then thousands of targets. The displays were completely saturated. German night fighters scrambled. Ground controllers tried to vector them toward the bomber stream, but the controllers couldn't separate real bombers from window echoes. Their entire system had been rendered useless. Night fighters circled in frustration. Some pilots saw the aluminum strips glittering in the moonlight and realized they'd been deceived. But by then it was too late. The bomber stream had passed. That night, 791 bombers attacked Hamburg. 12 were lost. 12. Out of 791, a loss rate of 1.5%. Normal loss rates for Hamburg raids had been 5 to 6%. Without Window, they would have expected to lose 40 to 50 aircraft. Window had saved the lives of nearly 300 RAF crew members. In one night, Hamburg burned. The bombing created a firestorm that killed 42,000 civilians. The thermal updraft was so powerful, it created its own weather system. Hurricane-force winds feeding the flames. The city was devastated, and the German night fighter force had been helpless to stop it. Over the next few nights, Bomber Command returned. More Window, more fires, more devastation. By the time Operation Gomorrah ended, nearly 3,000 aircraft had attacked Hamburg. Only 87 were lost. Most of those to flak, not night fighters. The Kammhuber Line, Germany's intricate air defense system, had been rendered obsolete by strips of aluminum foil. But the British weren't done. Now that British engineers understood exactly how Liechtenstein radar worked, they developed a passive detection system. They called it Boozer. Boozer was a receiver tuned to 492 megahertz installed in RAF bombers. When a German night fighter's Liechtenstein radar painted the bomber, Boozer detected the signal and lit a warning lamp in the cockpit. Yellow light. You're being tracked by ground radar. Red light. A night fighter's airborne radar has locked onto you. If the red light came on, the pilot would immediately throw the bomber into a violent corkscrew maneuver. Hard turn, diving, climbing, corkscrewing through the sky. The night fighter pilot, closing for the kill, would suddenly lose his target. By the time he reacquired it, the bomber would be far away. And here's what made this brilliant. German night fighter tactics relied on sneaking up on bombers undetected, closing to within 300 meters before opening fire. But now the bombers knew they were being stalked. They could evade before the night fighter got into firing range. The hunters had become the hunted. German night fighter. Losses began to climb, but the British weren't satisfied with defense. They wanted to go on offense. If Liechtenstein radar transmitted at 492 megahertz, then British night fighters could build receivers that detected those transmissions and tracked them back to their source. They called this system Serrate RAF Mosquito, and Beaufighter night fighters were equipped with Serrate receivers. The system could detect Liechtenstein transmissions from 50 miles away. Now British night fighters could hunt German night fighters. The irony was exquisite. German night fighters, hunting for RAF bombers, were transmitting their exact position to any RAF night fighter in the area. 141 Squadron RAF was the first to use Serrate operationally. On June 14, 1943, a Beaufighter detected a Messerschmitt 110 night fighter using its Liechtenstein radar to search for bombers. The Beaufighter homed in on the radar signal. Visual contact. The Messerschmitt 110 exploded under cannon fire, the first of many. British night fighters began prowling the night skies over Germany, hunting the hunters, following Serrate signals to their targets. German night fighter pilots suddenly found themselves in a terrifying situation. If they turned on their Liechtenstein radar to hunt bombers, they advertised their position to British night fighters. If they kept their radar off, they couldn't find bombers in the darkness. Damned if they did, damned if they didn't. The statistics tell the story. In the 6 months after Sereti was deployed, RAF night fighters shot down hundreds of German night fighters. The Luftwaffe's night fighter force had been turned inside out. The capture of Schmid's Ju-88 and the subsequent deployment of Window, Boozer, and Serete fundamentally altered the strategic bombing campaign. Let's look at the numbers. In 1942, before these countermeasures, Bomber Command was losing about 5% of aircraft per raid. On bad nights, losses exceeded 10%. Remember, a bomber cruise tour was 30 operations. At a 5% loss rate per operation, your chance of surviving your tour was about 21%. 4 out of 5 crews would be killed or captured. Those are horrific odds. By late 1943, after Window, Boozer, and Serete were deployed, loss rates dropped to 2 to 3%. That sounds like a small difference, but it's the difference between probable death and a fighting chance. At 2% losses per raid, your chance of completing 30 operations jumps to about 55%. Better than even odds. The psychological impact was enormous. Bomber crews had been flying missions knowing they'd probably die. Now they had hope. Morale improved. Recruitment improved. Training standards improved. Bomber Command became more effective. But there's another consequence we need to discuss. The moral dimension. Because once Bomber Command could attack German cities with acceptable losses, they did so with a vengeance. The Hamburg firestorm killed 42,000 people, most of them civilians. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 killed between 25,000 and 40,000 people. Again, mostly civilians. These raids were enabled by the countermeasures developed from the captured Liechtenstein radar. Now, I'm not going to tell you what to think about the strategic bombing campaign. That's still hotly debated by historians. What I will say is this. The examination of that captured radar set gave British scientists the tools to effectively neutralize German air defenses. What they chose to do with those tools was a separate question. The Allies chose area bombing, deliberately targeting civilian populations to break German morale and industrial capacity. Whether that was morally justifiable, whether it was militarily effective, whether it shortened the war or hardened German resistance, those are questions historians still argue about. What's not in question is that the capture of Schmid's Ju-88 made it possible. The Germans weren't stupid. They knew something had changed. After the Hamburg raids, they analyzed recovered window strips. They understood immediately what had happened. They scrambled to develop countermeasures. First, they modified their night fighter tactics. Instead of relying on the ground-controlled Himmelbett system, they developed wild boar tactics. Single-engine day fighters, Me-109s and FW-190s, would be sent up to hunt bombers visually over burning cities, where the fires provided illumination. It was desperate, dangerous flying, but it worked to some extent. They also developed new radars on different frequencies. The Liechtenstein SN2 operated on a lower frequency that couldn't be jammed by the original window strips. The British responded by cutting window to different lengths. It became a constant technological race, each side developing new systems, the other side copying or jamming them. Countermeasure and countermeasure. But the Germans were always playing catch-up. The British had captured their equipment intact. They knew exactly what they were facing. The Germans had to guess. By 1944, Germany's night fighter force was a shadow of its former effectiveness. Losses mounted. Experienced crews were killed. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. The night skies over Germany, once deadly hunting grounds for German night fighters, had become killing zones for Allied bombers striking at will. Let's talk about the people in this story, Because technology doesn't win wars. People do. Remember them? The Canadians who flew that suicide mission in December 1942? Paulton, Barry, and Jordan received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Bigorre, Vachon, and Grant received the Distinguished Flying Medal. Harold Jordan lost the sight in his right eye from his wounds, but he recovered and returned to teaching after the war. William Bigorre wasn't so fortunate. After recovering from his wounds, he volunteered to return to operations. In April 1944, his Lancaster was shot down over Germany. He was killed. He was 24 years old. These men flew into hell to get information that saved thousands of lives. We should remember them. After defecting, they were interrogated by British intelligence. MI5 gave them fake identities. Schmid became Georg Steiner. Rosenberger became Helmut Paulsen. Cantwell became Alfred Hansen. They were assigned to work for the political warfare executive. Steiner worked for Sefton Delmer's black propaganda radio station, Gustav Siegfried Eins. This was a brilliant operation that pretended to be a clandestine German resistance radio station broadcasting from inside Germany. It was actually broadcast from England, but it fooled huge numbers of Germans. Even the FBI listening stations in America thought it was real until the British told them otherwise. Steiner helped write scripts that sounded authentically German. He provided insights into how ordinary Germans thought, what they'd believe, what would demoralize them. Paulsen and Hansen worked on similar propaganda operations and as camp visitors interrogating German prisoners of war. All three men were highly valued by their British supervisors. After the war, they kept their fake identities for the rest of their lives. Steiner eventually emigrated to the United States. He died there, still using the name George Steiner. His grave is in America. Hansen also moved to America. His grave is there, too. Paulsen stayed in Britain for a time, then moved to Spain, where he died in 1993. None of them ever publicly discussed their role in the war. They defected because they hated the Nazis and wanted to help defeat them. They succeeded. The unsung heroes of this story are the engineers and scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment. Names you've probably never heard, but they won the electronic war. They designed Chain Home, the radar system that won the Battle of Britain. They developed AI radar for night fighters. They analyzed captured German equipment and designed countermeasures. They invented Window, Boozer, Serrate, and dozens of other systems. These weren't soldiers. They were physicists, engineers, mathematicians, many of them quite young. They worked around the clock in secret facilities. They tested equipment in dangerous flight tests. They turned scientific theories into practical weapons, and they're a big reason why the Allies won the war. We should remember them, too. May 9, 1943. A Junkers Ju-88 lands at RAF Dyce. It seems like a small event. One aircraft, 3 men defecting. But the ripples spread outward. Within weeks, British engineers understand exactly how German night fighter radar works. Within months, they've deployed 3 separate countermeasures that effectively neutralize the German night fighter force. By 1944, Bomber Command is striking German cities with near impunity. By 1945, Germany's war machine is being systematically destroyed from the air. And it all started with one defecting pilot and the engineers who examined his aircraft and realized the Luftwaffe couldn't see the trap. This is the power of intelligence, of understanding your enemy's capabilities, of exploiting weaknesses. The Germans had built an incredibly effective air defense system. The Kammhuber line was sophisticated, well-organized, and deadly. But it had flaws, and once those flaws were understood, the entire system crumbled. This story has lessons for today. In modern warfare, electronic warfare is even more important than it was in World War II. Radar, communications, GPS, computer networks, all of these can be jammed, spoofed, or hacked. Understanding your enemy's systems is crucial. One captured piece of equipment, one defector, one successful intelligence operation. It can change the course of a war. The night skies over Germany in 1943 were lit by burning cities. Thousands of German civilians died in those raids. Thousands of Allied bomber crew members died in those same skies. The moral weight of that destruction is something historians still grapple with. But from a purely technical standpoint, what happened was this. British engineers examined German night fighter radar. They understood it completely, and they realized the Luftwaffe couldn't see the trap. 3 countermeasures: window, boozer, serrate, each one exploiting a weakness in the German system. And Germany's night fighter force never recovered. Sometimes wars are won by great generals, sometimes by brave soldiers, and sometimes by quiet engineers in laboratories, examining captured equipment and figuring out how to turn the enemy's greatest strength into their greatest weakness. This was one of those times.